So yeah, thank you very much for inviting me to speak today. As Ray said, I'm a principal consultant with Resource Futures, and we are a UK-based environmental consultancy. We've got a head office in Bristol, and I lead up the Scottish team here in Glasgow and Edinburgh. And we predominantly focus on waste and resources. So the circular economy is obviously a very big thing for us, a big buzzword at the moment. And also we, in Scotland specifically, are a framework contractor to Zero Waste Scotland, who are able to provide a lot of free support to small and medium-sized companies. I appreciate, obviously, universities aren't SMEs, but the people who you employ through your various contracts are. So making them aware of this free support and that they tap into it really before the money runs out. I won't mention the European sourcing of that funding, but needless to say, it will run out eventually. So I think there is an opportunity for people to get involved and get free support. Equally, if you don't want free support and you want to pay full price for it, then I'm obviously very happy to have that conversation with you as well, especially for those dialing in south of the border. So the topic today being circular construction. I've got a construction background and I've been trying to be a waste advocate for the last 15 years, and specifically in the construction sector. And what I thought I would do is give you a bit of an overview of what circular construction is, but also my view on how the industry is performing right now when it comes to waste and resources. And it is just my view, so it's not any official government views or anything like that, but it's my scorecard of how they're performing. And then lastly, where I think clients such as universities have a role to play in what it is that you should be doing, what opportunities there is for you, and also what you should be asking of others. So that's hopefully the intention of the presentation, and I'm happy to pick up any questions at the end. So firstly, what is circular construction? I mean, it's not just lots of circular pictures, which you'll see in this presentation. But what it is a way of approaching construction projects. We want to look at a building in layers, as this diagram kind of alludes to, so that we can maximize material value. Now, certain items and certain layers within a building have got different longevities, they've got different lifespan expectations, which can mean that they could be installed and never replaced, or they could be installed and replaced every 5 years, every 3 years, every 2 years. And what we're trying to say is what happens to that material and that waste at its end of life? Can we recover it? Can we regenerate it? Can we reuse it? Can we recycle it? And all these decisions can happen much, much earlier in the process, and we can enable that to happen by thinking about it much earlier. So we do that by asking a plethora of people in the supply chain to consider what their impacts are, how they measure it, how they monitor it. And there is no one discipline that this sits under. The architect has a role to play, the contractor has a role to play, the material supplier has a role to play. And that's where circular construction is a bit difficult to try and implement. Now, I could put up the standard butterfly diagram of circular economy, but I think probably everyone's seen that to death. But I guess the message from that is recycling is considered to be the worst scenario, which is unusual. We normally think of that as being something we should be striving for. But in a circular economy, recycling is almost the baseline. That's where we should be aiming to start as our fallback. Then we're looking at how can we recover that into a second life material? How can we then repair it so that it continues within its existing life? And then can it be reused in its current format as well? So that's moving up the waste hierarchy. And there are different opportunities for different materials and different layers in a building. So there is no single solution, unfortunately. Why do we need it? Well, to quote Jan Poletsky of International Waste Association, the 20th century has been the great acceleration period. our population growth has been by a factor of 3.7. Our annual extraction of construction materials has grew by a factor of 34. And compensating alongside that, our greenhouse gas emissions grew by a factor of 13. So what we're seeing is that we are building a lot more. Our population is growing, so we need to build to accommodate that. But we've not been very good at managing our finite resources in terms of, can we reuse materials? Can we make sure that they're closed loop and that we're not losing them into landfills? So we're getting faster and faster and faster at building and consuming more and more materials, and eventually that bubble's going to burst. So some interesting stats that he threw up. Globally, an area the size of the UK has been converted to buildings since 1990. And even more scarily, that China used more cement than the entire USA in the 20th century in a 2-year period. Now, that's not to say that us in the UK, our impact is insignificant, or that we shouldn't be taking action just because China's so huge and that their expansion is going to dwarf ours. What that shows is that globally this is a ticking time bomb, and we all need to play our part and lead by example. So we in the UK construction industry, as estates professionals, we need to be considering what we're buying, how much of it we're buying, and how much of it we can conserve at the end of its use. So, as I said, my construction sector performance scorecard, I wanted to kind of run through some of the key attributes of how globally and UK and in Europe the construction industry is performing. So the first thing of material consumption. Well, as we've seen from the previous slides, we're not consuming less materials, we're only consuming more. Now that means that for every virgin product that's produced, there are greenhouse gas emissions that are being produced with that. There is the embodied carbon impact of that product. So to simply say that we've got a tender out and we've got a £15 million building, that is one stat, but the material cost of that building is perhaps something else that we should be looking at for every project, in terms of what is the tonnage of materials that we've consumed and what is the greenhouse gas emissions from those materials. Could we have chosen an alternative product, perhaps? So I'm afraid I'm having to give us a fail in the typical university fashion. I'm not sure it's quite as dramatic when students get that result. The second one, as I mentioned earlier, material embodied carbon. The direction of travel is that materials are becoming more and more complicated and higher performance. So the greenhouse gas emissions involved in producing these materials is increasing as well. So our direction of travel globally is that we will predicted, I think, to consume over 300 megatons of carbon in the material consumption sector in the next 50 years. So again, if we don't start to think about this metric as a way of measuring not just the total tonnage of what we consume, but also how energy efficient can they produce those materials, then that has a knock-on impact to the built environment sector. So embodied carbon is there is embodied carbon databases that exist. I would say that material manufacturers are not being pushed hard enough to provide that information to clients and to contractors. So we need to set the scene, we need to ask the question so that they are challenged to quantify what their embodied carbon impact is, so that you, when you buy those materials, you know the impact of it when you buy it. So it is getting better, there are standard values out there, but in my opinion, this has not been pushed hard enough. So I'm afraid it's another fail at the moment. In terms of waste generation, once we've actually consumed our materials, we've built our buildings, we've used them, we've got the waste that's produced in the construction process, you've got the demolition at the end of life. In Scotland, construction waste accounts for 44% of the country's waste. Now that stat hasn't went down over the last 10 years. So we are nearly half of the country's waste comes from our industry. And to be honest, we're the elephant in the room. Now, we can focus on single-use plastics and cups and straws and all these things that are very high in the media right now, but for me, construction waste is something that it's too much of a given. The fact that we make 44% of the country's waste every year from this sector, and that's okay. Now, by weight, we will always be number one, unfortunately. I doubt we're ever going to not be number one as a sector, but when you tip out a typical mixed waste skip and you find that what's in that skip is 13% is over-ordered, unused, brand spanking new material, 26% of what's in that skip is packaging waste. Now, nobody wants to dispose of packaging waste, so why aren't we challenging manufacturers to take things back? Why aren't we challenging them to take excess materials back? There's a lot more that we can do. So I'm not saying that we will ever get to zero production of waste, but we're certainly not managing it as efficiently as we could. So again, it's another fail. The construction waste recycling. So once we've produced this waste and what we're doing with it, as I said, reuse is pretty low at the moment, but recycling, we're actually in the high 90% recycling. But what I would say is that a lot of that waste is downcycled. So it's not, for example, to take glass as an example, glass going returned back into glass manufacture is the best loop that we'd like to see from a carbon perspective. But often what happens is it gets crushed into aggregates. So technically it's recycled, but that's downcycling. So I've given a bit of a partial pass on this one. It's good that we are a high recycling sector, but is recycling always the right option? I think, as I discussed earlier, no, it's not, and we're not doing enough to promote reuse, and we're not doing enough to push waste prevention in the first place. So simply having a recycling target in contracts is actually hurting a lot of construction projects. Reuse is the fifth subject I wanted to touch on. As I said, I've been through construction waste skips and I've pulled items out of the skips that are worth £3,000 as a pump, and there's two of them in there, and people have just thrown them away because it's easier to throw them away than it is to take them back and admit that you'd over-ordered in the first place. Now that lost value of the material production, the lost cost, the lost labour, as well as then having to pay to dispose of something, just doesn't sit very well with me. We wouldn't go to Asda or other brand name supermarkets and then throw away 13% of what we purchased straight away, but that's what we tend to be doing in the construction sector. So reuse is another one that we're not currently doing enough with. So I think my screen just disappeared there. Oh, there we go. So again, it's another fail for that one. So what can clients do? I think the first thing is realising that waste is your problem. It's not the contractor's problem, even though they're responsible for disposing of it. It is ultimately, from a duty of care point of view, the client's problem. It is that client's waste. So what we have to do from a circular context is set the scene as clients. Now, I've put 4 steps here as what I expect clients to do. The first one is the UK Green Building Council has just published in the last month a circular economy guidance document for clients because if I asked you right now, how do you do this? How do you implement circular construction? It's a difficult thing to do. This guide I would recommend highly as the first port of call. It gives practical examples. It gives suitable guidance as to what the client brief should be, and also what the business case for doing this is, because ultimately it's not just from an environmental context, the circular economy. It has to be economic as well as environmental. So that's the first thing, is read up on this good practice guide. The second step, you don't need to be in Scotland to use it, but Zero Waste Scotland has a model procurement wording guide. Now that means that there are model clauses that you can drop in as a client to challenge your design team, to challenge your contractors to improve right the way from rebus stage A right the way through. And also those model clauses exist for the contractors and how they pass that responsibility down to their supply chain as well. And that is recognising that the big boys will have heard of the term circular construction, but a lot of the small SMEs in the supply chain will never have heard of this terminology in their life. But when you break it down and say, what we're really asking you is, can you take back your waste offcuts? Yes, we can. That's quite an easy thing to understand. And then you say, well, that's an example of circular construction. And then they turn around and go, we never realised that. So part of the work that Zero Waste Scotland's been doing up here is to work with the construction sector, particularly the SMEs, on educating and raising awareness, but also providing them with one-to-one support to look at how they can improve their own practices, or can they actually produce a circular product? So do they have a waste from one sector that can be turned into a product for another? Or is there a circular business model that they can explore? So these two guides are two things that I think are the first two steps. The third one is to measure and monitor. I'm very much a stickler for, I don't see clients asking in tenders for waste forecasts. Now, what you'll end up with is waste built into your project cost. But at the end of the job, when the contractor turns around and says, we produce 300 tons of waste on your project, is that good? Is that bad? Or is that indifferent? And you don't know unless you've got a forecast at the beginning. Now, if you can get all of your contractors at a tender stage to give you their forecasts, the price will be linked to that forecast. So you can use it as a differentiator and say, well, that contractor A's got a forecast of 400 tons, contractor B's 300 tons. So if we go with contractor B, it's going to cost us less because they're predicting that they're going to produce less waste and there's less financial impact on my project. So I would extend that to then material consumption. And this is something that we're seeing very much in Europe and Holland, that circular construction. If you try and build anything that's not circular in the likes of Amsterdam right now, good luck. The region, the municipality has took a very proactive approach and said, we want circular solutions. That's our base offer. So they want to know how much materials you've consumed in building this, which forces people not to overorder, because what happens to it at the end of it, you've got the waste to forecast at the other side as well. So too often I've seen a requirement that says, produce a site waste management plan. Now, a good site waste management plan has a forecast in it. So that's my one take-home message today, is make sure you're asking for forecasts, because they can produce it, and there are tools and there are guides and there's websites out there to help them do that. So make it visible as a measurable outcome. And then lastly, tell the story. If you've got a circular product that you've used, even if it's just one, I think a lot of people get scared thinking, oh, I can't say I'm going to specify a circular building because I need every product in the building to have a circular story. You don't. Everything just starts with one product, and then we can build on that. And I think there are a lot of people out there trying to get products and business models out there to market, and they need the case studies. They need those clients who are willing to experiment. And I think that's where the university sector actually lends itself most to circular construction. You are the building owner and occupier of this estate. You're not a house builder who builds it and walks away and then doesn't actually care about how it performs in its actual use. So a lot of circular business models work for portfolio owners such as yourselves, where the financial impact can be, is it a reduced capex cost because we're moving things into OPEX or not, as the case may be, or is it a circular product that we're trying at the capital stage? But the important thing is shout about it. Tell people what's worked, tell people what hasn't worked, because we do need to build on this story. And as you see from the bottom of the guide there, Image, there are a number of clients that have been involved in the production of this in terms of the Crown Estate, to make sure that they're setting the agenda and they want their estate and their projects to be circular going forward. The next thing that I wanted to touch on is I'm starting to go into the realms of what's not perhaps immediately possible, but is one for the future. Material banks, or buildings as material banks, is a new concept which is coming out of Europe, where you've paid £15 million for a building, and you've built that building, you're going to occupy it for X number of years, and then at the end of that building's life, you're going to refurbish it a number of times, and you're going to demolish it eventually or deconstruct it. Now, the materials that you have in that building have a value. And is there a way of you designing that building at the beginning so that you can increase that material value? So if you could extract that material from the building in a format that allowed it to go to a higher value or a higher use recycling, that's worth more than just sending the wrecking ball through at the end at a demolition stage and you've lost that value. Now, it's the same with refurbishments. If you know what's went into your building, over time, you can track that material and its value. So a lot of people are exploring this concept just now, and they are trying to communicate the value of that to clients and asking contractors, you have all this information on the products that you've put into my building. Can you give me that in a way that tells me, almost like a savings account? I want a way of regularly accessing that bank account to see how much my building's worth. And because I asked the designers to design it in a circular way, I actually know that I can recover a huge proportion of that steel or that bricks or that plastics or that glass in 15, 20, 25 years' time. And I think that's, for large portfolio owners such as yourself, that's the challenge, is how do you get that material out and a value at the end that you win again, that you don't, it's not just a lost asset, it's actually there's a financial return to you as well. So I would encourage you to have a bit of a research into this topic, and I know a number of people who are actively trying to come up with tools and ways of doing this in an automated fashion. So to help with the material banks is another concept called material passports. Now, this is again something that's been piloted out of a project in Europe, where I think there's over 300 products right now that have material passports, because people will put a higher value on a material if they know where it's been, if they know who produced it, how regularly it's been maintained throughout its life, who's maintained it, who's serviced it, what's its condition. So all of this information that you as estates professionals have, if you can produce that in a material passport value, that material can actually have a higher value at the end of it, and it can give confidence to the market, which might be the actual manufacturer of that product. A lot of product manufacturers produce them, they get sent out to projects, and then they never ever find them again. So to take an example of that, we've got, I think, 4 glass manufacturing sites in the UK, and they're running out of silica sand to produce glass. So if you could turn around to the glass manufacturers and say, here is my building, it's completely glazed, it's going to have X tons of glass that I've designed it in a way that it's going to be available to come back to you in 10 years' time or whatever. They can put a value in that, and if you can help instruct a demolition industry or a deconstruction industry, hopefully it is by then, to extract that material, then who's to say there isn't a financial transaction that comes back to you as a building owner? So again, thinking about linking material passports to material banks helps to do that. So again, this Buildings as Material Banks project that started in Europe, the BRE were involved in that, and typical with the BRE, they're trying to think of a tool that they can develop as to how you can assess how circular your building is. Now, what they've done is they've come up with this circular building assessment concept, which pulls in environmental evaluation, economic evaluation, but also reversible building design. So I'm quite amazed that we still build buildings right now that we cannot get material out of and recycle at its end of life, because we've put it in such a way that it's so bonded, it's so structurally connected that we can never get that material back. You spend a fortune on it, you insert it in a building, and then you never get it back. So this reversible building design concept is something that we can challenge designers to think about. So you combine that with the likes of BIM, material passports, certain user information, and the BRE platform that they've been developing should be able to spit out an answer of how that building scores. Now, it's still some way off from being used in anger, and I'm not saying that BRE won't commercialise it and charge you money for it, but I guess that it's more of a concept right now in terms of thinking how, at the end of you've built a building, or even you've refurbished a building, or any existing building that you have right now, if you were to ask yourself the question, how circular is this? How recoverable are my materials? You don't necessarily need a score to know that. I think we know our building estate quite well, and we know where we can improve, especially with new builds. That, for me, if we can't get this right with new builds, we'll never get it right to try and apply it to the existing estate. So that's why I do keep talking about new builds, but it's not uniquely linked to new builds only. In Scotland, as I mentioned earlier, there is business support. So what I think as clients that we can all be smarter about doing is directing our resources and our bidders and our tenderers to say, you must work with Zero Waste Scotland. You must work with whatever free resources are out there, because I don't want to hear that you can't do it or that you've never done this before. Because one, there is support out there to do it, and two, quite often your parent company has done it elsewhere in the world. It's just you've never been asked to do it in Scotland. So now I'm asking you to do it in Scotland, so draw on the resources. So in Scotland we have this circular economy business support. Now whether that is you just being the facilitator of that and hosting an event that invites in the supply chain and says, we'll have Zero Waste Scotland talk about the free support that they have, or whether that's bringing in a consultant like myself and saying, help me set the brief and help me set the direction of travel and monitor and measure it throughout the project. However you want to do it, I guess what I'm saying is that you don't need to be circular experts, the same way as I completely agree that you've got enough on your plate and your day-to-day job. But I think what I've been trying to talk about through this presentation is that building as we've always built, we can't continue that anymore. So we do have to change the way we're building and we're approaching these tenders. And for me, the construction industry is actually one of the few sectors out there that if you set them the challenge, they can answer the question. It's just about setting them the challenge. And too often I've seen great construction companies talk about example projects that they've done, and I'm amazed that they never replicate that as business as usual. And the response that they will always give is the client never asked us. So I guess what I'm saying is the clients have to ask that to begin with. The last thing that I wanted to touch on, again from a Scottish context, there are circular regions right now. So that again, this is another support mechanism that is run predominantly by the Chambers of Commerce in these 4 areas. We've got Edinburgh, Tayside, Glasgow and North East, which is really Aberdeen and Grampian. And these networks of support are there to try and help facilitate businesses to upskill and improve and bring products to the market, and shine a light and tell the story on circular products. Now, I do know that there are cities down in England as well. You've got Circular Peterborough. We are very much involved in Circular Bristol. And you've got London as well, in terms of the LWARB London as well. So this regional approach is starting to gather a bit of momentum, and that you might think, well, I don't want to be the only client in town asking for this. You might very well not be. You might be one of 50 who are actually starting to band together and say, in our region, we want circular procurement, we want circular materials, and we want the buildings to be built in a way that allows us to maximise the value in the assets. So that was a bit of a whistle-stop tour to circular construction, and some of the things that I would hope that some of it's practical, some of it's theoretical at the moment, but will hopefully become more practical.